Hello, everybody. It is Saturday, June the 28th, 2025, the last Saturday in June. Yesterday, we did a show with the New York based expert on American culture, Philip Kadish, on what he calls the Great White Hoax. 2 centuries of selling racism in America. It's all these pseudoscientific theories of why white people are superior to blacks. Lots of very fraudulent claims that perhaps white people are better at making money than whites, better capitalists. Today, we are shifting the focus in a way, but perhaps covering the same sort of ground, but in a very different way, with my guest, Rachel Laryea. She is a PhD from Yale. She works at JP Morgan Chase, and she has a new book out called Black Capitalists, a blueprint for what is possible. She's joining us from Brooklyn, New York. Rachel, congratulations on the new book. I have to ask you this question first. I'm sure it's the first question everyone asks you about this book. Is there a difference between, and I ask particularly in the context of some of these pseudoscientific theories of why whites are superior to blacks, that Kadish covered in The Great White Hoax. Is there a difference between black and white capitalists? Why'd you call your new book Black Capitalists?
Yes, and there can be a difference. I'm very intentional in the book about defining what I mean when I say Black capitalist, because people might have just kind of preconceived notions about what that identity even means. And for me, to be clear, a Black capitalist is someone who identifies as a Black person and strategically repositions themselves within the economic system in order to create social good. And so that definition alone kind of really ruptures modern conceptions of what capitalism even is, which is all about private ownership and the pursuit of excess resources, excess capital. So it's really about private ownership and profitability. Whereas to be a Black capitalist, as I define it, is someone who is still kind of in pursuit of excess resources, but it's also with the intention to create and produce social good. And so much of this book is really about how race can make a difference and how we participate in capitalism, and how that difference really teaches all of us something about how to create a more equitable version of the political economy. And so it's often the case that for so many of us, capitalism might be this kind of negative thing, or we have visceral reactions to the idea of capitalism. We have critiques of capitalism, and especially within the Black community, that's the case because of the history of Western capitalism, where Black people have been the greatest commodity, but have never really been the beneficiaries of capitalism. Systematically, that's been the case. And so what I offer is a new way to think about how can we use the tools of capitalism in service of something else while remaining critical of it. Because it's the case you can be critical of something while still use the tools of it strategically for your own ends or for that of your community. And so to answer your question, there can be similarities, but what I'm offering as a kind of solve for the moment that we're in is a new definition of what it means to practice Black capitalism and to be a Black capitalist.
This question, again, is one that I'm sure you get all the time. Isn't your analysis rooted in class, or shouldn't it be rooted in class and poverty rather than race? A couple of weeks ago, I did a show with Jimmy Chen, the son of a Chinese immigrant, CEO of Propel, who claims at least, and seems to be doing good, helping the poorest Americans online in terms of accessing payments from the state. Why is this about race and not class, or do you collapse the two?
So it's about both. And that's really important to highlight, because when you think about systemic inequality that's predicated on racism, implicated in systemic inequality focused on racism is also a story about inequality when it comes to classism as well. And the people who are most disproportionately affected when you think about lack of access, lack of resources to capital, it is Black and Brown people. Again, it speaks to what I mentioned before. When you think about the creation of Western capitalism in this country, based here in the US, I am, Black people have been the commodities during the time of legalized slavery. Black people have been the labor source in the creation and the kind of foundational building of capitalism, but we have not been the beneficiaries of it. And so you see the interconnectedness and the intersectionality between race and class. And when you think about the racial wealth gap, for example, and why it is Black and Brown people are constantly behind their white counterparts when you think about home ownership, small business kind of creation and flourishing, financial wellness and literacy. There is a correlation between race and class. And so by writing this book about Black capitalists, it's really an attempt to look at both race and class, race and money together because they are really inextricably linked.
Couple of months we did a show with the Brookings Institution scholar Andre M. Perry. Has an interesting new book out, Black Power Scorecard, Measuring the Racial Gap and What We Can Do to Close It. He's a researcher, highly analytical, data expert. He suggests that the racial gap in America, at least, is closing. Do you agree with him in your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I think you have more Black millionaires today than you've ever had in America before. But that doesn't address the fact that there is still severe systemic inequality, even still. So what, Andre Perry offers by way of solutions in different kind of arenas, whether it be kind of in government, in corporate, even on the individual level, the community level, we're going to need to be very strategic in our thinking about how we can really start to solve and continue to close that wealth gap. I work at JP Morgan Chase, for example, and so much of my work before I transitioned to wealth management at the firm was helping the firm in the kind of deployment of $30 billion as part of the racial equity commitment at the time. And so that contribution, that commitment was really in service of closing the racial wealth gap, but the work continues. And you might hear $30 billion and think that that's a lot of money, that's a lot of resources, and relatively it is. But we're coming up against hundreds of years of strategic and systemic inequality. And will it close in our lifetime? I don't think so. But there's still evidence that even despite just how severe the gap is, there are kind of indications that progress is being made. And so that's where we need to continue to do the work, again, in all different arenas in order to close it. But I don't think it's something that will happen necessarily soon.
Tell me a little bit about your background. There was a piece in Entrepreneur magazine about how you were raised by an immigrant single mom and that you experienced culture shock working at Goldman Sachs. You're at JP Morgan Chase now. What does your background, your life experience, you went to Yale, you got a PhD there. How does that fuel, so to speak, your thesis in Black capitalists?
Yeah, so I'd say I've always been interested at the intersection of race and money. Even as a child, you speak of my mom, and she immigrated to the US in the 80s, really in search of this kind of elusive American dream.
Where from?
From Ghana, for both my brother and I. And I learned from an early age what it meant to be in spaces of privilege that I never felt as though I had authority in. And so, for example, my mom, through the help of an affordable housing program and a lottery system, was able to buy her first home in the US. And it was in the wealthiest county in Northern Virginia at the time. And so I lived there. And as you mentioned, my mother raised my brother and I alone. And it was a very white community. And so every instance, every model that I saw attributed to wealth was correlated to whiteness. And so from a young age, I always kind of wondered, what would it mean to be Black and wealthy? What would it mean to really access and tap into Black thriving? And what would be the cost of it? And so fast forward, I went to some of the best academic institutions, both in high school and even college. And while I was at NYU for undergrad, I was raised in the kind of Black radical tradition, critical race theory. Um, and so much of the teachings that I was learning was really kind of telling a very singular story and narrative about Black people's relationship to capitalism. And that was predicated on the history of much of what I mentioned before when you think about the creation of Western capitalism. But soon, right before I was about to graduate college, I interned at Goldman Sachs. I was recruited, and it was an opportunity I actually didn't take quite seriously when I was invited. It was actually my brother who, really kind of admonished me to consider the opportunity. And it was only through my time at Goldman that I saw and really began to kind of open the aperture for myself about how I thought about how Black people can relate to capitalism, because I hadn't seen examples of Black wealth and Black thriving. Because again, as I mentioned, growing up, every instance of wealth was attributed to whiteness. But my time at Goldman kind of really ruptured that paradigm for me. And so I was really kind of curious to pursue that question of what does Black thriving mean? What does it look like? How can it be accessed in a way whereby people participate in capitalism differently? Because again, the capitalism that we know today and engage in really is predicated on exploitation and extraction and the reproduction of harm in different levels throughout the kind of end-to-end supply chain. But the people I was encountering were really kind of asking themselves, how can I still be in pursuit of financial freedom, economic security, while do no harm, while not be exploitative, and asking themselves, how can I tap into that kind of future for myself in a way that it's not dependent on someone else's exploitation. And so that kind of journey for me personally and professionally is what really became the conceptual kernel for this book, and why I wanted to see it through and really tell the stories of others, myself included, and also do a kind of social and cultural analysis of the reasons why people relate to capitalism the way that they do, the kind of desires and motivations they have around that kind of participation in capitalism, as well as the kind of social trends and phenomenon that we see today that are expressions of capitalist activity, and how we can relate to the economic system differently from a point of agency and empowerment as well.
You work at JP Morgan Chase. You started at Goldman. These are what some people might think of, at least, as white banks. They're certainly the heart of American capitalism. Is there any contradiction there, Rachel? That you're working at the heart of American capitalism in New York on Wall Street, and yet you're imagining and peddling perhaps a different kind of capitalism?
Yeah, people will often say, "Oh, there's a contradiction," or the idea of black capitalists or black capitalism is oxymoronic. But the reality is, we navigate contradictions every single day. America is a contradiction, and yet we navigate it without question. And so when you think about what it could mean to tap into Black thriving, being very kind of cognizant of the economic system that we're in today, it requires one to be in it, but recognize and be critical of the system. And it's only through that kind of critical thinking are you able to participate in it differently and thereby start to slowly transform the system itself. And so rather than kind of thinking of it as a contradiction, it's more so about a strategic orientation and awareness of what the system is, what it can produce, both good and bad, and how you're going to engage in it in order to create positive outcomes for oneself and community. And so that's my orientation when I think about my relationship to JP Morgan Chase, the work that I do, because I'm always asking myself the question, within the seat of privilege that I'm in, how can I create access to resources for those who don't also occupy the same seat that I'm in?
So you're in wealth management. That means you manage wealthy people's money. Does that break down in racial terms, or are you colorblind when it comes to your clients?
So the work that I do in wealth management is research. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about and creating mental models around how people think about investing, managing their wealth. And that kind of informs how we then develop and refine our products and our offerings to clients. And so much of that research, I'll literally go to people's homes, interview them, spend time with them, and learn about their motivations and desires around investing. And where it really shows up, the kind of racial dynamics, is really around our screeners and our recruitment of clients that we bring in. And so when I mention that I'm always thinking about how can I use this seat of privilege that I'm in, of course, from a compliant perspective to the firm and being respectful of the firm as well, is how can we get more diverse voices and experiences into the fold to only thereby make our products more desirable and more effective and compelling to a broad and diverse group of clients. And so that's always kind of my personal mandate in the work that we do. How can we further business objectives while still doing it in a way that's going to increase opportunities and access for diverse clients? Because I think the space of wealth management has been predominantly white. And so for me, I'm always thinking about how can we, again, open the aperture of how we think about wealth, who has access to wealth, and how can we create and further wealth for our clients beyond the scope of what we've done historically and for who we've served historically.
Although I assume JP Morgan Chase, or at least in the wealth management side, you're not taking on poor clients because there would be no business model there. You mentioned that your mom came from Ghana in the 80s. She's an immigrant. You're obviously Black, and you write about Black capitalists and Black capitalism in an American context. The vast majority of American Blacks, of course, came here in a very different kind of context. Do you sometimes think of yourself in different terms to many Black Americans? Do you think differently, or is skin color more important than the context of immigration?
Yeah, I'll say, just first to clarify, the book really kind of captures Black capitalism and Black capitalism in a global context, not just in an American one, because even within an American context, there's still a kind of global story happening. I was born in the US, but I very much had a Ghanaian experience, even in an American context. But to answer your question, there is a lot of nuance and complexity within the Black community, which is not monolithic. We all come from different places. I have my roots on the African continent. Others are from different parts of the African diaspora. And I think so much of how that's shown up in my own experience is that there can be cultural differences, underlying cultural differences, and also what we understand our rootedness to come from. I think for Black Americans who do not have a sense of rootedness to a home outside of America, and because of the ways in which America has been strategically, systemically kind of taken and apprehended from Black Americans, there can be a sense of imposter syndrome to name America as home, but then constantly be reminded through the institution that is America that it is also not your home, because safety at a fundamental level is not something that's guaranteed to Black people. And I think Black Americans can feel that, and have the kind of intergenerational legacy of that more so than, say, someone like me. And so I name that and acknowledge the differences. But at the same time, despite the complexity and kind of cultural differences, there's still an overarching kind of shared set of desires and motivations that we all have, especially when we're thinking about it in economic terms. We all aspire to lives of comfort, for our needs to be met, for our families to be taken care of. And so much of the story, again, is about how do we collectively, acknowledge the differences that we have, but move on the kind of common ground that we do share, which is around the kind of thriving and nourishing lives that we all want for ourselves.
How much of what you're discussing is new? I know in the book you touch on Booker T. Washington and his famous debate with W.E.B. Du Bois about education and economic progress. Do you think anything much has changed since the Booker T. Du Bois debates or conversations?
Like I said, I think we have more Black millionaires than we've ever had in America before. I think financial literacy and education is becoming more and more democratized. And the conversation around wealth building and intergenerational wealth building is growing. And you see more access to private ownership within the Black community than you've ever seen before as well. And so, what has stayed the same to a degree is that, especially within the Black community, we continue to have this debate that's really centered around our economic identities. Some people might be capitalists, some people might be anti capitalist, others are socialists. And that becomes a roadblock to unified action to kind of meet the moment that we're in acknowledgement of the fact that we can agree that capitalism is fraught with problematics. It's not in service of us. So we need something else. But we also need to be realistic about where we are and what it's going to take for us to get to that something else. But we've gotten stuck, I would say, in the debate. But in light of that backdrop that I mentioned that is new, I think such a time as this for us to really align on unified action. And so that's also the call to action in the book around how can we think about our position within capitalism differently as agents that do have power to kind of create new outcomes within the system and thereby transform it, and to really kind of open the aperture again around how we think about the ways in which we can participate in capitalism. And so I would say that is a new kind of offering and an intervention on a very long kind of discourse that we've been having about race and money.
I know you have a couple of interesting examples, or several examples in the book of models of Black young contemporary capitalism. Wamimo, Abbey, you write about, Sangu Deli. I want to come to those in a minute. But I wonder if any successful white capitalists offer a model for Black capitalists. We did a show earlier this week with Armin Rosen. He's a writer for Tablet magazine. He has a new piece out entitled Unnatural Immunity. What exactly is Bill Gates doing in Africa? Which is very critical of Gates's involvement and his investment or his philanthropy in Africa. I'm curious as to your thoughts on guys like Gates giving huge amounts of money to Africa, and whether there are white capitalists who offer a model for Black capitalists, or at least could partner one way or the other.
Yeah, I'll say the book is titled Black Capitalists. I focus and center my work on Black people and providing solutions for Black people. Even so, Black capitalism, which I also define as a pragmatic theory whereby private actors and collectives do that same work of repositioning themselves within capitalism in order to produce social good. And that's race agnostic. And so there can be examples of non-Black people participating in Black capitalism. And I think, sure, we can point to different examples of people like Bill Gates, repositioning themselves or perhaps, allocating resources in different ways to create social good. But I think so often the case is, and again, it's not to critique anyone or any institution, but those instances might not always be sustainable. And so for me, why, again, I focus on the Black lived experience is because, especially in the political moment that we are in, the cavalry is not coming. We see the strategic kind of dismantling of DE&I initiatives, programs that have aimed to create access and channels to opportunity. And so much of my work is really focused on how can we create the tools and the systems within our communities and leverage allies, because there is a place for them within this kind of broader pursuit of economic freedom. But again, it really starts with us and looking within and creating those mechanisms ourselves, because yes, while it's always helpful to have the support of allies and the redistribution of wealth in that sense, it also needs to start with us and create the kind of building blocks towards tapping into Black capitalism and the kind of economic possibilities it can create.
You note that the cavalry isn't coming. You're not the first or the last person to talk about that. Nicole Hannah-Jones has a piece out in the New York Times today about Trump upending 60 years of civil rights in 2 months. You mentioned the dismantling of DEI in the United States. What is the role, in your view, Rachel, of the state, of the federal bureaucracy and laws in terms of supporting, stimulating Black capitalists?
Again, I think that we are in a very fraught time. I think it's a time that we have to really look sharp and acknowledge just the stakes of everything that's happening. And you kind of flashed Nicole's work focused on how Trump has upended 6 years of civil rights in 2 months. And we have to take seriously just the implications of that. And it's why I say that we have to look internally, look within our communities for the solutions, because we cannot look elsewhere when we are in this moment of dismantling at a strategic and a federal level. And so it just kind of brings me back to this thinking around how can we really create the kind of mechanisms, the systems of support, and the wealth and capital distribution that we need when we can't look elsewhere for different organizations or institutions to support in that effort.
How rotten is American capitalism? We're speaking in the week where Jeff Bezos, Laura Sanchez got married in Venice, enormously controversial, a great deal of hostility towards Bezos in Venice, including massive demonstrations. Celebrities, of course, flocked to this wedding. What's wrong with capitalism? I know it's a big question, Rachel, and it's not perhaps the central focus of your book. But are people like Bezos, are they exhibit A and Laura Sanchez exhibit B in the corruption, the materialism, the rottenness of American capitalism?
Yeah, what's wrong with capitalism is that it is predicated on um, exploitation, extraction, harm of some sense. Because when people are in it to own things, when people are in it to be profitable, because that is the fundamentals of capitalism, that means other people are going to suffer to some degree. And I think why people can be so critical of people like Bezos is the fact that you can have a billionaire exist while still have people who don't have access to meet their fundamental needs to food, water, shelter. Those two things should not coexist. And so that becomes, I think, the heart and the foundation of critiques of such billionaires. And so that, again, I think with that backdrop, the question then becomes, how can we look within ourselves, look within our communities to create new outcomes? Because we know capitalism as it is not going to save us based on what it's designed to be, also based on the ways in which it's been racialized and how Black and Brown people have been on the losing side of capitalism, if you will, from its inception. And so now it's, how do we reckon with the reality of this economic system that's not going to be dismantled tomorrow, but still take some level of ownership and responsibility for it and acknowledge that the agency that we do have in it, even despite the fact that the majority of us are not billionaires. So those become the questions in order to really kind of start to transform the system slowly but surely.
I mean, if Bezos wasn't so busy getting married in Venice and he was on the show, he might say, well, I've created hundreds of thousands of jobs. I'm not doing any damage. I've made the world a much more convenient place, a more fun place. How does somebody like Bezos differ from some of the models in your book? Like, as I said, Wemimo Abbey and Sangu Deli. Tell me about these men and what they're doing and why it's different from people like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or even Bill Gates.
Yeah, so for someone like Wemimo Abbey, so he's the co-founder of Isusu, And Isusu is really focused on creating financial visibility for the country's most financially invisible people through rent reporting and credit building. So the idea being, if you're a renter, you should have access to credit and credit worthiness. The idea is, if you're paying your rent on time, that should be reported to the credit bureaus, which then gives you greater kind of credit visibility and then leverage in the financial sense. And so through that work, through the B2B business, the value to the end consumer is unlocking access to capital that they might not have had access to: personal loans, business loans, mortgages, etc., to really kind of open again the aperture for wealth and wealth building for people who otherwise might have never had it. So it's really about how can you create financial visibility that will then create material outcomes for people. When it comes to
Can I just jump in? I don't know that much about Esusu, but it's a black-owned unicorn fintech, meaning that it's a private company that's valued at over $1 billion.
That's right.
They're making money. I mean, what's the difference between Esusu? I mean, we talked earlier about Jimmy Chen and Propel. That sounds more similar, but is there a real difference between companies like Esusu, which are, as I said, a unicorn, $1 billion private company, and traditional Silicon Valley companies? They're all in the business of making huge amounts of money.
Sure. And Black capitalism is a story about profitability, but it's also about social good. What Isusu has done is create access for people to get credit and to get capital resources as well, which otherwise wouldn't have happened. You mentioned Bezos. If he were on the show right now, if he weren't getting married, he might say that, oh, I'm doing a similar thing. I'm creating social good. I would question that perhaps. And the set of questions are, within the end-to-end supply chain, is anyone being exploited in that process? We look at and we see how there are protests, how different employees will try to unionize when they're thinking about what the work culture is like, what's the culture of these places, how people are treated, what are kind of the labor practices, are people paid well in a way that they can sustain their lives? These aren't the questions or the problematics at an organization like Isusu, where I've personally spent hours and hours doing participant observation, talking not just to Isusu, but clients as well and employees about how do you build a culture that's ethical and morally sound? How do you build a business that's profitable, but not attached or reproducing or creating harm or exploitation of your employees or of your clients? And how do you create value in such a way that ruptures kind of historical and present relationships that people have to capitalism, that does not create new economic futures for them? When someone has now access to a loan to buy a home and they can build equity over time and then create intergenerational wealth, that's a substantially different thing than getting a package in 2 days. And so I think we have to be very intentional about what is the outcome and what is it creating by way of new possibilities for people. Sam Goodell, it's the same kind of story around, he worked all over Wall Street, took those skills he acquired, went back home to Ghana, where he's from, and really created an investment firm really focused on creating value for the African consumer, creating value for the African person. And what's really compelling and radical about that is when you look at the African continent, you see through colonialism and neocolonialism the ways in which resources on the African continent have been extracted and deployed in all different parts of the world, specifically in the West. And so while Africans, again, are the key laborers or the dominant laborers in this narrative, they are hardly ever the beneficiaries of the resources that exist on the continent. And so for him, he's thinking about, how can I deploy and invest resources in institutions, startups that are really going to put the value back in the hands of Africans themselves, and do it in a way that's really focused on Pan-Africanism. I told you before about how I'm having a very Ghanaian experience in an American context. And for so many Africans living in America, they're also thinking about their families and their communities back home, an ocean away, as I am, because the majority of my family is there now. And so when you think about startups and the creation of different businesses that really bridge these kind of cultural, geographic boundaries on how do we think about Pan-African economic building that's not just about creating value within one country, namely Ghana in this instance. It's really around how to create an economic movement channeled through different businesses that focus on my experience and how it's connected to someone in Ghana or someone in any one of the 54 African countries or throughout the African diaspora that's going to create new economic power for the African continent, but then also really connectivity across Black people at a global scale. Because as I said, this is really a global story, not just an American one.
Another very successful Black entrepreneur that you write about in the book is Jay-Z, celebrity, very successful, very high visibility. Is there any difference between, or why is Jay-Z different from non-Black celebrity entrepreneurs, multimillionaires and billionaires?
Yeah, so one of the fundamental points of the book is that race makes a difference in how we participate in capitalism, which I mentioned before. And my kind of articulation of Jay-Z and study of him within the book is to model how when the person in question, the millionaire in question, is Black, the standard by which they are held to is different. Namely in his deal via Rock Nation with the NFL coming after Colin Kaepernick and his protest. People were kind of in arms and highly criticizing him for the fact that, he made this deal with the NFL, and, there were questions about his commitment to the Black community, and people were saying, oh, Jay-Z is a capitalist. But you have to ask the question, would the critique have been that strong or that fierce, or would there have been a critique at all if it were a non-Black person making a similar deal? We see the ways in which, and there's a whole theory around what is called the Black tax. When people ascend the kind of economic social ladder, they are held to different standards than their non-white counterparts. And Jay-Z is one example of that. And so it's really a way for us to start to think about how is it that oftentimes correlations that we see around wealth and whiteness are not questioned. But when we see Black economic thriving, we question why they should be thriving, why should they have excess resources, and we start accounting for what they do with their excess resources. And so that's just one example of how race can make a difference and how people participate in capitalism, how they're perceived at the social level, and also how they are received in terms of their kind of acceptance within the Black community or otherwise as they ascend the social ladder.
One Black capitalist who's been in the news is Sean Diddy Coombs, who's a highly visible trial. I don't know whether you deal with him. I don't think you deal with him in your book, but is his treatment different from a white criminal or a potential white criminal?
I also just have to say, I think you named him as a Black capitalist. And I want to be clear that there is a difference between being a Black capitalist, as I define it, and being a Black person who participates in capitalism. If you're invested and identify as a Black capitalist, that means you are, as I mentioned, strategically repositioning yourself and really thinking about both profitability and social good. If you are a Black person participating in capitalism as we know it, which is predicated on profitability and private ownership, and can very much be uprooted through exploitation and extraction and harm, you could very well be reproducing the harms of capitalism as a Black person. I'm not suggesting that in the case of Diddy, but I am going to say that I just want to be very careful about when we use the term Black capitalist and where we ascribe it, because that is very important. And it's also been the case. We've seen historically all the ways in which the prison industrial complex and the system, when it comes to punishment within kind of the legal system, negatively affects Black and brown people, and the ways in which racism kind of shows up in the legal process. And so I'll name that kind of blanket statement. I haven't stayed close to the Diddy case, and so I can't speak to ways in which perhaps he's been treated differently on account of race. But we do know that the prison industrial complex has negatively and kind of disproportionately so affected Black and brown people.
Finally, you're a Black capitalist in your own way. You work at JP Morgan Chase, but you also have your own business, Kelewele, Kelewele. I hope I pronounced it right, or I haven't completely mangled it. Tell me about that and how it might be perhaps a slightly lower key and more fun version of good capitalism or Black capitalism.
Yeah, so Kalawale is really my plantain love story. Long before Kalawale was the name of my business, it's actually the name of a popular plantain street food, which is basically ripe plantains diced up, coated with spices, namely ginger, and fried to golden perfection. And it was a dish my mom would make for me growing up as a kid, because again, I had a very Ghanaian upbringing in certain ways, and I loved it. And over the years, plantains had more and more significance to me. I started college in New York City, and I was definitely a student on a budget. And I was also transitioning into a plant-based diet at the time. And so plantains, you could get them four for $1. They were very affordable at the time for me. And also, they're a great dairy and meat substitute. So I kind of fell in love with them again. And then fast forward once more, when I was in my kind of Anthro 101 classes at Yale, anthropology so much is a study of culture, especially the sociocultural anthropology field. And we're always asking ourselves as anthropologists, how is culture created, defined? How is identity formulated as a byproduct of cultural expression? And I kind of had this light bulb moment of thinking about food as a medium and a lens to think about culture. And I love the fact that I can be Ghanaian, the next person can be from the Caribbean, the next person from Latin America, all parts of the African diaspora, and we're all eating plantains, though we're preparing them differently. And so I really wanted to build the business focused on cultural familiarity, innovation, health, and wellness. And so I started in 2018 doing festivals and pop-ups, and then had a brick and mortar location, and also had a location at the Barclays Center here in Brooklyn. And now it's totally e-commerce and wholesale. And so that's been a really kind of beautiful expression for me that's rooted in culture, but also my creativity, and it's just fun, a kind of quirky business, but still thinking about how can you bring people together and also just put a smile on people's face, and have them enjoy food from a place that feels familiar but still fun and new.
In other words, a blueprint for what is possible, especially when it comes to eating. Rachel Laryea, author also of Black Capitalist. Interesting new book, interesting thesis. Rachel, best of luck with the book. Best of luck with the plantains. I'm going to go and have some lunch now. You've made me hungry. Thank you so much.